Ross is back. At least that's what this video was supposed to be about. Then I discovered my Ross phaser is actually broken. Something in here is not working right, and I think I know what it is. We'll get into how it's broken later in the video. It sucks. This is actually one of the ones made in Kansas. I think it says the year actually. I wonder if they still cover the warranty on this one. You think I could hit up JHS for a warranty claim on this guy? Pretty cool what's inside here. This is one of the original Ross phasers from the 70s. And if you don't know what a phaser sounds like, it sounds like this. What you heard during the Barracuda intro is a flanger though. That's a slightly different effect. And I'll use that to get into my next segment, the Ross flanger. Let's tuck that back there. The Ross flanger is definitely one of my favorite flangers. There's just something cool about it. As you can see, it kind of gets you close to that heart sound. I originally bought this flanger because I thought it was the flanger they used on Barracuda, but I actually learned that it wasn't that pedal. It actually was this kit that you could buy from Popular Electronics in 1976. It's really cool. I've actually found some magazine articles here if you look. Go ahead and pause if you want to read some of them, but it basically describes to you the schematics, like every component and basically how it works. It's really cool. And then you would order the components from a company called Phoenix Systems, and they would send you all these pieces, and that's what they did for Hart during Barracuda. They don't really exist these days, but being able to find the actual article where it was listed in a magazine is pretty cool. Kind of gives you an idea of what it was like to buy electronics back in the day. Kind of crazy what you could buy from a magazine back then. If you want to get close to the flanger, apparently a company called Toadworks makes something called the Barracuda flanger, which apparently they teamed up with Howard Leese, who was one of the guitarists in Hart at the time. He actually helped produce the record that Barracuda was on. But apparently one of the founding members, Roger Fisher, doesn't agree that it sounds close at all. So I'll let you decide. Eric Johnson uses one, so maybe it's good. Is it close? Who cares? It's probably fun. Now, there's always a debate. Is vintage gear better than new gear? Is new gear better than vintage gear? Honestly, people will probably argue till the end of time which one is better. To be honest, I think something that people miss in that argument, though, is that at one point, that vintage gear wasn't actually vintage. At one point, that gear was brand new. And we covet these things with some sort of imagination of what it sounds like, but in reality, we don't know what it sounded like that day it first came out. We know what it sounds like when it's 50 years old or 60 years old. You know, it doesn't sound the same. The components age, all the things in electronics age. We age, everything ages. But basically, those things aren't going to sound as new as they did. They're probably going to get duller or start acting weird, much like my phaser. Basically, this phaser turns on, but it doesn't actually phase anymore. It just kind of turns on and it kind of sucks the signal away. The further we get away from the things that were created, I think we start to get this distorted view on what it actually was. You know, we revere all these things, but were they really as good as we think they are? In reality, the companies that try to recreate these products end up making it as if it was brand new. And I think that's ultimately why it throws off a lot of people on why it doesn't sound the same. And that's why I think the debate between vintage and modern is just kind of flawed. The reality is vintage gear is fragile. It's delicate and it's gonna break eventually, probably sooner rather than later. And I'm a little bit of an electronics guy myself, so I've tinkered with pedals and I think I know what's probably wrong with this one. It's probably one of these little IC chips. And if you don't know what these are, they're basically these little computer chips that make effects make their effect. It's something that happens pretty commonly with a lot of these old modulation pedals. And the sad reality is they don't make some of these chips the same anymore. They're used for time delay effects usually, and flanging is actually a form of time delay. It's kind of like a fancy clock, and it's what allows delays and flangers to happen in pedals. And it's actually an everyday technology too, like your phone. You've probably seen headlines like this. Yeah, IC chips are kind of all over the world, even in guitar pedals. And they were kind of a big deal when they came out. You've probably heard of something called Bucket Brigade Design, BBD. It's basically an IC chip that came out and revolutionized guitar pedals and a lot of other technologies. But back in the day, you used to have to use tape machines and tubes and all this different equipment, racks of gear to try and even attempt to make some of these really cool effects that you know and love today. And with the introduction of something like the Bucket Brigade chips, you had the ability to put stuff in pedal form. Flangers, delays, all kinds of effects were able to be at the tip of your fingers or the tip of your toes. They really opened the world for companies like MXR and Boss when it came to guitar pedals. And all of that was basically a step in the direction away from tubes and tape, kind of a step closer to a digital world. At this point though, these pedals are from the 1970s, and at the time of shooting this video, these are like 50 years old. I'm surprised they work at all, to be honest. That's 50 years later. Now, I'm not sure gear manufacturers thought that 50 years from now, we'd be foaming at the mouth for vintage pedals and vintage guitars. Maybe they did. Like seriously, imagine some dude making a 59 Les Paul back in the day, just going on about his day, probably made a few that day, went home, ate some dinner, not knowing that he would have contributed making a guitar that's worth like $1 million in this day. Crazy. Crazy. I mean, look at people like Joe Bonamassa, for instance. This guy's buying every 59 Les Paul in the world at this point, but he plays them. He takes them out on the road. He takes his old Fender amps. He takes Strats, Telecasters. I mean, this guy doesn't care. I mean, like he does, but for him, it's like the whole point of the gear is to use it. And then you've got someone like Metallica. Kirk Hammett's rocking Greenie right now on tour with Mammoth and doing some world tour. And to me, I'm just like, dude, you're using this priceless guitar on stage, and the road is tough on guitars. There's a lot of sweat, humidity, they just get rusty, they get corroded, it's just nasty. But that's the whole point of the instrument. I mean, that's what they did back in the day. They played the instruments. Those guitars from the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, they played them. They modded them. They wrecked them. They destroyed them. They did whatever. They played them. They didn't hang them up on a wall and just decide to look at them forever. And it's not to say that there are some historical pieces that, you know, shouldn't be pristine. I think there should be some museum pieces for sure, totally. But for the average person, I think a lot of us look at getting that one thing, that vintage cool piece, and, you know, we're kind of afraid to touch it. We're afraid to look at it, breathe in its direction. But in reality, I'm pretty sure whoever owned it before you would have wanted it to be played. And at some point, this stuff won't be playable anymore. The glue's gonna fail, the wood's gonna crack, it might rot. Who knows? Either way, maybe you should start playing some of it. Luckily, you've got companies like JHS reviving companies like Ross. I don't know if you've seen their documentary, but they've got a whole documentary about the history of this company and just how loved these pedals were by a lot of people. I'm gonna go ahead and put a link in the description for you that you can watch after this video. They're kind of these iconic little boxes that people saw and probably thought they were awesome because they just look really cool and they had some really cool sounds. It was a competition to MXR back in the day, and it seems like there's a lot of history with this company, and it's cool to see a company brought back because having something like my phaser break just makes me remember that these pedals I have are gonna break and I probably won't be able to play them anymore. So a company like JHS reviving these pedals means I'll actually be able to buy one of the new versions, which I might be doing for this phaser, unless they want to send me one. Will it sound the same? I don't know, because I can't really use this one, so it doesn't matter to me. If anything, this looks really cool and it'll continue to look awesome. Maybe I'll fix it. I don't know. We'll see. You've got companies that are building recreations and basically reviving old keyboards, compressors, audio equipment, and I think for a little while I was kind of thinking to myself, why don't they make something new? But at this point, I think it makes sense reviving these old products, because the reality is I can't buy a vintage LA2A. I can't buy a vintage 50s Gibson, but I can buy a custom shop 50s Gibson. I could buy a new version of a Juno keyboard. That's the reality of the future of technology right now when it comes to music. So do you have any vintage gear that's too vintage to touch? Let me know in the comments below. Peace out.